Hey guys, tonight we begin with something ancient Rome quietly excelled at. Conspiracies. Not the modern kind with blurry theories and comment sections. The real kind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 44 before Christ, Julius Caesar was assassinated. And what makes this one of the most unsettling conspiracies in Roman history is not how secret it was, but how incredibly obvious it was. By this point, Caesar had accumulated an amount of power that made the Roman Republic look less like a republic and more like a suggestion. Dictator for life, honors piling up, statues, titles, subtle hints that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't planning to give that power back. And the Roman elite did not love that, because Romans had a long-standing cultural allergy to kings. So naturally, instead of sending a strongly worded letter, they started planning his assassination. Whispers spread through the Senate. Quiet meetings, side glances, the kind of atmosphere where everyone feels something is off, but continues attending meetings anyway, which is very Roman behavior. Except here's the part that makes it almost ridiculous. Caesar was warned multiple times. A soothsayer told him to beware the Ides of March, which is not vague. That is basically ancient Rome's version of a flashing red warning sign. Then there was the note. According to sources, someone tried to hand Caesar a written warning on the day itself, a document that allegedly contained details of the entire plot. He didn't read it, which suggests that even in ancient Rome, important documents were occasionally ignored at the worst possible moment. Then there was his wife, Calpurnia. She had nightmares about his death and begged him not to go to the Senate. At this point, Caesar had a prophecy, a written warning, a concerned spouse, and still thought, yes, I will attend this meeting. Confidence is admirable. This might have been something else. And then there's the conspirators themselves. These were not mysterious figures hiding in shadows. They were senators, colleagues, people Caesar saw regularly, men like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gas Cassius Longinus. Not exactly subtle. This wasn't a hidden conspiracy. It was more like a poorly kept group project that everyone knew about, but no one wanted to interrupt. So on the Ides of March, Caesar walked into the Senate. No guards, no real concern, just the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. And within moments, the rumors stopped being rumors. The whispers became knives. And the conspiracy that had been discussed, hinted at, and practically announced finally happened. Because in ancient Rome, the most dangerous plots weren't always the secret ones. They were the ones everyone knew about, and somehow still went ahead anyway. After Caesar's assassination, Rome entered a phase historians politely call instability, which is a very calm way of describing civil wars, shifting alliances, and a general atmosphere of, let's see who survives this. Out of that chaos emerged Augustus, and if you asked Augustus what he was doing, he would tell you something very reassuring. He was restoring the Republic, giving power back to the Senate, stabilizing Rome. Definitely not becoming a king, which to be fair is exactly what someone becoming a king would say. Augustus was a master of presentation. Unlike Caesar, who had collected power openly and made people nervous, Augustus moved slowly, carefully, almost politely. He accepted titles one at a time. He refused power until it became necessary. He positioned himself as the protector of the Republic, while quietly making sure that nothing important happened without him. It was subtle, very subtle. So subtle that many people at the time convinced themselves that nothing unusual was happening except for the small detail that Augustus controlled the army, the treasury, and most political decisions. But other than that, completely normal. There were rumors, of course, that this whole Restoring the Republic Act was exactly that, an act that Augustus had no intention of stepping aside, that he was building something new, a monarchy just with better branding. At the time, these suspicions sounded a bit cynical, because Augustus was careful. He respected traditions. He avoided the title of king. He kept the Senate functioning. He made everything look familiar. And that was the genius of it, because people don't panic when things look familiar, even if everything underneath has changed. Over time, however, the reality became impossible to ignore. Augustus wasn't temporarily holding power. He was the system. The Republic destroy the Republic dramatically. He replaced it slowly, which is far more effective and much harder to stop, because by the time people realize what's happening, it's already done. If you were living in Rome during the reign of Augustus, you might have noticed something interesting. People around him had a habit of dying. Not dramatically, not loudly, just conveniently. And standing very calmly in the background of all this was Livia Drusilla. Now, officially, Livia was everything a Roman elite woman was supposed to be. Dignified, intelligent, loyal, supportive, always present, always composed, always exactly where power was. Unofficially. There were rumors, lots of them. Because Augustus had a succession problem, he needed a clear heir to stabilize his carefully constructed system. But several of his chosen successors, young promising men, kept dying before they could actually succeed him, one after another, which statistically starts to feel less like bad luck and more like a pattern. Names like Gaius and Lucius Caesar, potential heirs, died unexpectedly. Others were removed from the line of succession under circumstances that made people curious. And who benefited from all of this? Eventually, it was Tiberius, Livia's son, which is where the rumors become very specific. People began whispering that Livia was not just observing events. She was influencing them, possibly arranging them, possibly accelerating them. Poison was the favorite explanation, because in Rome, poison was the quietest solution to a political problem. No public confrontation, no obvious conflict, just a sudden illness and a funeral. At the time, these accusations were hard to prove, which is exactly what made them so effective as rumors. Was Livia actually responsible? We don't have definitive proof, but modern historians tend to agree on one thing. The suspicions were not unreasonable because the pattern is difficult to ignore. Potential heirs disappear. Her son rises. Power consolidates. And through all of it, Livia remains calm, respected, and very close to the center of authority, which makes her one of the most fascinating figures in Roman history, because she represents a type of power that is easy to overlook, quiet, patient, indirect, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. And in a world full of very loud conspiracies, sometimes the most effective ones are the ones that barely make a sound. When Tiberius became emperor, people in Rome had a theory. He was paranoid, suspicious of everyone, constantly worried about plots, ordering trials, executions, and investigations that seemed excessive, even by Roman standards. From the outside, it looked like classic imperial overreaction, the kind of ruler who sees danger everywhere, even when it isn't there. Except in Rome, that assumption comes with a problem because very often the danger was there. Tiberius inherited an empire that had just survived civil wars, power struggles, and a carefully managed transition from republic to monarchy that nobody officially called a monarchy, which means trust was already in short supply. And on top of that, the Roman political system encouraged competition. Ambition wasn't hidden. It was expected. Senators wanted influence. Generals wanted power. Advisors wanted proximity to the emperor. And when you combine ambition with opportunity, you get conspiracies, real ones. So when Tiberius started acting cautiously, watching people closely, reacting quickly to threats, allowing treason trials to expand, many assumed he had gone too far, that he was imagining enemies, that he was ruling through fear. But here's where things become uncomfortable. Some of those threats were real. Plots did exist. Rivalries did turn into schemes. People did look at the emperor and think, I could do better. Which means Tiberius wasn't operating in a safe environment. He was operating in a very dangerous one. And instead of trusting people, he stopped completely. Over time, Tiberius withdrew from Rome entirely and ruled from the island of Capri. From there, he governed at a distance, relying on reports, advisors, and a system that increasingly revolved around suspicion, which only made things worse because the more he withdrew, the more rumors spread. And the more rumors spread, the more suspicious he became. A perfect cycle. But here's the key detail. The conspiracy theory that Tiberius was surrounded by plots and threats, that people were actively trying to undermine him, that he couldn't trust the system he ruled, it wasn't entirely wrong. In fact, it might have been one of the most accurate assessments of Roman politics at the time. Because in a world where power constantly shifts and loyalty is negotiable, paranoia stops being irrational and starts being preparation. While Tiberius slowly withdrew from public life and relocated to Capri, Rome didn't exactly pause. Power doesn't like empty space. It fills it. And in this case, it was filled by a man named Suganus. Officially, Suganus was the commander of the Taurian Guard, the elite unit responsible for protecting the emperor. Unofficially, he was becoming something much more interesting. As Tiberius distanced himself from daily politics, Sergius remained in Rome, handling communication, managing access to the emperor, and influencing decisions, which sounds administrative until you realize what that actually means. If you control who speaks to the emperor, you control what the emperor hears. And if you control what the emperor hears, you start shaping reality. Sanus understood this very well. He consolidated power quietly. He reorganized the Taurian Guard, bringing them together into a single camp just outside Rome, which made them more efficient and more loyal to him. He removed rivals through accusations of treason. He influenced trials. He positioned himself as indispensable. From the outside, it looked like he was simply helping manage the empire. From the inside, it looked like he was building his own. Rumors began to spread that Sanus wasn't just loyal, he was ambitious, that he wasn't just serving the emperor, he was preparing to replace him. At the time, these rumors sounded like the usual Roman paranoia, another powerful figure being accused of wanting more than he officially claimed. But here's the uncomfortable part. Those suspicions were not wrong. Suganus had begun maneuvering himself closer to the imperial family. He pursued alliances. He positioned himself as the natural center of power in Rome, while Tiberius remained distant. Step by step, he moved from advisor to gatekeeper to potential successor. The problem with subtle power is that it works until someone notices, and eventually, Tiberius did. From Capri, the emperor began receiving reports, quiet warnings, indications that Silvanus might not be as loyal as he appeared, which led to one of the most dramatic reversals in Roman history. Because in Rome, you can rise quietly, but when you fall, it is usually very loud. When people think of Nero, they usually imagine chaos, fires, executions, music, questionable decisions. And for a long time, historians debated whether his reputation was exaggerated. Was Nero really that bad? Or was he just the victim of hostile sources and political propaganda? Because Roman writers had a tendency to dramatize. But here's the uncomfortable answer. Some of those wild rumors about Nero, they were probably true. Even during his reign, people whispered that Nero was involved in a series of very convenient deaths. Rivals, advisors, family members, people who quite frankly had a habit of becoming obstacles. The most famous example, his mother, Agrena the Younger. Now, Roman politics between family members was already complicated, but even by those standards, this situation escalated quickly. At first, Nero tried to distance himself from her influence. Then, according to ancient accounts, he tried to have her killed more than once. One of the attempts allegedly involved a specially eased collapsing boat, which is already a very creative solution to a family disagreement. Unfortunately for Nero, the boat plan failed. Agrena survived, which made things awkward, so Nero chose a more direct approach. He had her assassinated. And while ancient sources sometimes exaggerate details, modern historians generally agree on one thing. This part is very likely true, which tells you a lot about the environment Nero was operating in. But it doesn't stop there. Rumors also surrounded the deaths of other figures close to him, including his wife Octavia and various political opponents. At the time, some people dismissed these stories as gossip because they sounded extreme. But as more evidence and analysis emerged, the pattern became clearer. Nero wasn't just reacting to threats, he was removing them proactively, which is a much more controlled form of chaos. So, the conspiracy theory that Nero was secretly orchestrating deaths around him, it wasn't entirely a theory. It was closer to a strategy. Because in ancient Rome, power was rarely maintained through trust. It was maintained through control, and sometimes that control was very final. In the year 64 after Christ, Rome burned. Not metaphorically, very literally. A massive fire broke out in the city and spread rapidly through its crowded streets. Wooden buildings, narrow alleys, and closely packed neighborhoods turned Rome into something dangerously flammable. Within days, large parts of the city were destroyed, homes, temples, shops gone. And as the flames died down, the rumors began. Because in Rome, disasters were rarely seen as accidents. There was a standard reaction. Poison, not investigation, not confusion. Just poison because poisoning wasn't rare. It was normal. Romans were absolutely convinced that elites were quietly eliminating each other with toxins, and for a long time, historians thought this might be exaggerated, dramatic, overstated. The kind of thing people say when they don't understand why someone died. But here's the problem. The Romans were probably right. Poisoning in the Roman world was disturbingly common, especially among the upper classes. It was discreet, effective, and most importantly, deniable. No public fight, no visible violence, just a sudden illness followed by a funeral and a lot of very careful silence, which made it perfect for political situations. Unwanted heir, rival gaining influence, relative becoming inconvenient. There was a solution, and it didn't require an army. One of the most infamous figures associated with this was Lusta. Yes, Rome had professional poisoners, which already tells you everything you need to know about how often this method was used. Lusta was employed by powerful figures, including reportedly Nero, to create poisons tailored to specific situations. Fast acting, slow acting, subtle, very subtle. The kind of customization you don't want in a society. There are strong indications that poison was used in several high-profile deaths, including that of Emperor Claudius. Ancient sources suggest mushrooms were involved, which means even dinner could be dangerous. And suddenly, those Roman dinner invitations feel a lot more stressful. At the time, accusations of poisoning were often dismissed as rumors because they sounded dramatic, convenient, too easy. But as more evidence has been studied and patterns examined, historians have increasingly accepted that poisoning was not just occasional. It was part of the system, a quiet, efficient way to solve problems that would otherwise require open conflict. Which means the conspiracy theory that powerful Romans were constantly poisoning each other was not paranoia. It was basic awareness. Because in a world where power is everything and trust is limited, sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not a sword, it's dinner. By the time Commodus came to power, Rome had already developed a strong tradition of political suspicion. People assumed plots existed because they usually did, and Commodus did absolutely nothing to calm those fears. In fact, he made them worse, much worse. Commodus ruled like a man who had discovered absolute power and immediately decided to use it in the most unpredictable ways possible. He styled himself as a living god. He renamed Rome. He participated in gladiator fights, not as a spectator, but as a performer, which for an emperor was about as appropriate as a CEO deciding to personally run customer complaints in a boxing ring. It made him popular with some. It made the elite deeply uncomfortable. And when the elite in Rome become uncomfortable, they don't just complain. They start talking quietly, then less quietly. Rumors began to spread that Commodus was unstable, dangerous, a threat not just to individuals, but to the entire system. At the time, these rumors might have sounded exaggerated because surely the emperor wouldn't be that reckless. Surely there were limits. There were not. Commodus increasingly sidelined the Senate, relied on favorites, and made decisions that seemed driven more by personal impulse than long-term strategy, which is not ideal when you are running an empire. So naturally, people started thinking about solutions, permanent ones. And this time, the conspiracy wasn't hidden. It was expected, even anticipated. Eventually, a group formed that included members of his inner circle, people close enough to know his routines, his habits, and his vulnerabilities. Because if you're going to remove an emperor, it helps to know when he's alone. The plan was simple: poison first. Then, when that didn't work quickly enough, more direct action. Commodus was strangled in his bath, which is not a dignified ending. But then again, Roman politics rarely offered those. And here's the key detail. Nobody was surprised. The rumors had been there. The suspicions had been growing. The idea that Commodus would eventually be removed wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. Which makes this one of the clearest examples in Roman history, where the conspiracy theory wasn't speculation. It was a countdown, and everyone knew how it would end. They just didn't know exactly when until it happened. By this point, Roman politics had already developed a reputation: unstable, competitive, occasionally fatal. But what happened after the death of Commodus pushed things into a completely different category, because the next conspiracy theory wasn't about whispers or suspicion. It was about something so absurd that people at the time could barely believe it. The Roman Empire was for sale, and not metaphorically, literally. After Commodus was assassinated, and a level of unpredictability that made even experienced Roman elites uncomfortable. At first, many assumed these stories were exaggerated because Roman historians had a habit of turning disliked emperors into dramatic, cautionary tales. Surely, it couldn't all be true. Surely some of it was embellished. It was just not as much as people hoped. Elagabalus came from the eastern provinces and was deeply devoted to a sun god known as Elgabal. When he became emperor, he didn't quietly adapt to Roman traditions. He tried to replace them. He elevated his god above Jupiter, Rome's chief deity, and attempted to center Roman religion around it, which in a city built on tradition was not a popular move at all. But it didn't stop there. Ancient sources describe behavior that seemed designed to provoke confusion and outrage: lavish banquets, unusual ceremonies, unexpected decisions that ignored established norms. At the time, many Romans believed these stories were either exaggerated or politically motivated, because it's easier to assume exaggeration than to accept that your emperor is genuinely unpredictable. But modern historians, while cautious, generally agree on one point. Elagabalus was indeed unconventional. Perhaps not every story is accurate, but enough of them align to suggest that the overall picture is not entirely fictional. Which means the conspiracy theory that Rome was being ruled by someone completely detached from its traditions and expectations was not really a theory. It was a situation, and like most situations in Roman politics, it did not resolve peacefully. Eventually, members of the Taurian Guard, the same group that had already demonstrated flexible loyalty, turned against him. Elagabalus was assassinated, his body reportedly discarded, his memory condemned, which by now was becoming a pattern, because Rome could tolerate many things: corruption, violence, conspiracies, but unpredictability. That made people nervous. And when people in Rome became nervous, history tended to repeat itself. If you asked a Roman citizen whether the Senate was involved in conspiracies, the answer would likely be very simple: yes. Not always loudly, not always successfully, but consistently. Because the Roman Senate was not just a governing body, it was a collection of powerful, ambitious individuals, all trying to maintain influence in a system that constantly shifted. And when influence is at stake, cooperation tends to become temporary, very temporary. Throughout Roman history, emperors often suspected the Senate of plotting against them, and for a long time, historians debated whether those suspicions were exaggerated. Were emperors just paranoid, seeing threats where none existed, or was something else going on? The uncomfortable answer is both, because while some emperors absolutely overreacted, the Senate did in fact engage in conspiracies regularly against emperors, against rivals, against anyone who became too powerful, too unpredictable, or too dangerous to ignore. The Senate had a long tradition of defending the idea of the Republic, even after the Republic had effectively ended, which meant many senators quietly resented imperial authority. They couldn't openly oppose it. That would be unhealthy. But they could influence it, undermine it, and occasionally attempt to remove it. Some conspiracies were successful, others failed. Many were discovered before they could fully develop, but the pattern remained. Plotting was not unusual. It was expected, and this created a strange dynamic. Emperors didn't trust the Senate. The Senate didn't trust the emperor, and both sides were often correct, which meant Roman politics operated in a constant state of tension. Not open war, but not peace either. Something in between, a quiet competition for control. Where conversations mattered, alliances mattered. And sometimes so did timing. Because if you moved too early, you failed. If you moved too late, you were removed. And if you did nothing, someone else would. So the conspiracy theory that the Senate was always plotting, it wasn't paranoia. It was a job description. Because in Rome, power didn't sit still, and neither did the people trying to control it. By this point, a pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Assassinations, poisonings, power grabs, unexpected deaths that everyone quietly expected. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, one realization starts to form. Conspiracies in Rome weren't rare. They were structural. From the final years of the Republic to the height of the Empire, power in Rome was never truly stable. It didn't sit neatly in one place. It moved, shifted, adapted, depending on who was strong, who was connected, and who was still alive, which, as we've seen, was not always guaranteed. Take Julius Caesar. His assassination wasn't a sudden shock. It was the result of growing tension, visible ambition, and a group of people deciding that removing him was the only solution. Then take Aug. This mindset did not come from imagination alone. It was deeply rooted in religion, which during the TUDA period was going through what could generously be described as an identity crisis. Under Henry VIII, England broke away from the Catholic Church, and with that came a dramatic shift in how people understood the afterlife. The idea of purgatory, a sort of waiting room for souls, was swept aside by Protestant reformers. According to this new view, souls did not linger. They went straight to heaven or hell. And yet, people still felt them. This contradiction created a strange tension. Officially, ghosts were not supposed to exist anymore. Unofficially, everyone still heard footsteps in empty halls. Servants whispered about figures seen at the foot of beds. Travelers avoided certain roads at night, not because they were unsafe, but because something unseen walked them long after sunset. So explanations had to evolve. If a spirit appeared, it could not be a wandering soul from purgatory anymore. That would contradict the new religious order. Instead, it was often labeled something far more unsettling, a demon in disguise, something pretending to be the dead sent to mislead the living. Which, if anything, made the situation worse, because now every unexplained sound was not just a ghost. It might be something far darker, something actively trying to deceive you. Sleep became uneasy, nighttime became suspicious, and the ordinary world, once filled with predictable routines, now felt layered with invisible dangers. In Tudor England, fear was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It crept into daily life, sat beside you in candlelight, and followed you down long corridors when no one else was there. And once you accepted that the dead might still be watching, it became very difficult to ever feel truly alone again. If you lived in Tudor England, death rarely arrived without warning, or at least that's what people believed. The world was filled with signs, subtle, unsettling clues that something was about to go terribly wrong. And once you started noticing them, it became impossible to stop. One of the most feared omens was the sudden appearance of animals behaving incorrectly. A dog howling at nothing in the night was not just a noisy inconvenience. It was said to be sensing spirits nearby, often a sign that someone in the household would soon die. Cats, too, were treated with suspicion, especially if they stared too long into empty corners, which unfortunately cats tend to do anyway. Birds were perhaps even worse. A lone raven circling above a house could send an entire family into quiet panic. Owls hooting near a window at night were not charming woodland creatures. They were messengers of death, announcing that someone inside might not see another sunrise. And if a bird flew directly into a window, that was considered less of an accident and more of a very blunt warning. But animals were only part of it. The human body itself could betray signs. A ringing in the ears, a sudden shiver, or an unexplained feeling of dread. All were taken seriously. Even something as small as a candle extinguishing itself without reason could turn a calm evening into a tense silence, because if the light could disappear that easily, what else might follow? Then there were dreams. Dreams were not just dreams. They were messages. Seeing a recently deceased person in your sleep was often interpreted as a visitation, and rarely a friendly one. If they spoke, people listened carefully, sometimes waking with a sense of urgency they couldn't fully explain. Mirrors, too, carried their own dangers. If someone died in a house, it was common to cover mirrors immediately. The fear was that a wandering soul might become trapped inside the glass, lingering indefinitely. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How many mirrors were already occupied? Of course, not every omen led to death, but that uncertainty was exactly what made them so powerful. You could never be sure which sign was harmless and which one was quietly announcing the end of someone's story. So people watched, they listened, they interpreted everything. Because in a world where death left clues behind, ignoring them felt far more dangerous than believing in them. If omens whispered that death was near, castles were where those warnings seemed to settle and stay. Tudor England was filled with grand stone residences, impressive, cold, and according to many, already occupied by more than just the living. These were not simply homes of power and status. They were places where the past refused to remain in the past. Castles, by their very nature, were ideal settings for ghost stories. Thick walls trapped sound in strange ways. Long corridors stretched into darkness. Staircases turned sharply, often hiding more than they revealed. And at night, when candles burned low and servants moved quietly through shadowed halls, every small noise seemed to carry meaning. But the real reason, Castle, someone who knew a bit too much about herbs and remedies, all could quickly fall under suspicion. It did not take much. A single disagreement followed by a streak of bad luck could be enough to convince an entire village that something darker was at work. Curses in particular were deeply feared. A spoken word, a muttered phrase, even a glance held for too long. These could all be interpreted as acts of harm. People believed that witches could cause milk to sour, animals to fall ill, or children to become sick without any visible cause. And because these effects were invisible, they were far more terrifying. You could not defend yourself against something you could not see. Naturally, people tried anyway. Protective measures became part of daily life. Small charms were carried or hidden in homes. Certain herbs were believed to ward off evil, hung near doors or burned in fires. Prayers were repeated not just out of devotion, but as a kind of shield against unseen forces. Even the way a house was built could reflect these fears. Hidden marks carved into beams or doorways meant to confuse or repel malevolent spirits. But fear, as it often does, led to accusation. When something went wrong, and in Tudor England, many things often did, someone had to be blamed. Trials for witchcraft began to appear, where suspicion alone could carry dangerous weight. Evidence was rarely clear. It did not need to be. A pattern of misfortune combined with a reputation for being different was often enough to turn whispers into formal charges. And yet, there was a strange contradiction at the heart of it all. The same society that feared witches also relied on forms of folk magic. Healers, wise women, and charm makers were sought out for help, even as others were condemned for similar practices, which meant that the line between helpful and harmful was not always clear. In Tudor England, the unseen world was not distant or abstract. It was personal. It lived just beyond sight, shaped by belief, fear, and the quiet suspicion that sometimes misfortune did not happen on its own. In Tudor, England, not all signs came from ghosts or witches. Some came from a far higher authority, or at least that's what people believed. The world itself was thought to be a kind of message, constantly speaking through strange events, unusual weather, and moments that felt just a little too deliberate to be coincidence. These were not accidents. They were signs from God, and ignoring them was not considered wise. Storms, for example, were rarely just storms. A sudden violent thunderstorm could be interpreted as divine anger, a warning that something somewhere had gone morally wrong. Lightning striking a building was not just unfortunate. It was specific, targeted, almost as if heaven had made a decision. Comets were even worse. When a comet appeared in the sky, it brought with it a quiet wave of dread. These glowing streaks were seen as omens of major change, often tied to the death of a ruler, the outbreak of war, or a coming disaster. People did not look at them with curiosity. They looked with concern, wondering what exactly had been set into motion. Even small everyday events could carry meaning. A loaf of bread burning unexpectedly, a glass shattering without cause, or a sudden illness in an otherwise healthy person. All could be interpreted as signals, not random, not meaningless, but deliberate nudges meant to be noticed and understood. Of course, understanding them was the difficult part. Clergy often stepped in to interpret these signs, offering explanations that aligned with religious teachings. But interpretations varied. One event could mean different things to different people, depending on their fears, their hopes, or their current situation, which meant that certainty was always just out of reach. And yet, people continued to search for meaning in everything. Because in a world where God might be communicating through the smallest detail, nothing felt insignificant. Every unusual moment carried weight. Every disruption in routine hinted at something larger, something hidden beneath the surface of daily life. This constant awareness created a quiet tension. Life was not just lived. It was observed, analyzed, and interpreted. People watched the skies, listened to the wind, and paid attention to the smallest irregularities just in case they were being told something important. But there was a subtle problem with this way of thinking. If everything could be a sign, then how could you ever be sure when something truly was? In Tudor England, the search for meaning never really ended. It simply continued, day after day, shaped by a lingering sense that the world was always speaking, and that missing the message might come with consequences no one wanted to face. If daytime in Tudor England was filled with signs and suspicions, nighttime was something else entirely. When the sun disappeared and the last light faded behind timbered rooftops, the world